Prydeinig, good afternoon. A croeso cynnes iawn i drwm prynawn yma. Mae'n cyfroes iawn i gallu cyflwyno digwyddiad heno. Good evening and a very warm welcome to the drwm this afternoon. It's very exciting to be able to introduce the event. My name is Sally McInnes. I'm head of Unique and Contemporary Collection here at the library, and it's my great pleasure to welcome everyone who's in the drwm and everyone who's out there in the, in the remote world outside. So welcome to this Halloween seminar with folklorist Dr Delyth Badder, who will take us on a whistle-stop tour of Wales's ghostly folklore over the centuries, highlighting the myriad of unique motifs and themes that separate the appearance of the Welsh spirit from its British counterparts. Dr Delyth Badder, she's a folklorist and author who has channeled a lifetime's interest in Welsh folklore into academic study. She's an honorary research fellow in folklore with Museum Wales and is currently pursuing a master's degree in this field at Cardiff University. She is the co-author of The Folklore of Wales, Ghosts, a new study of Welsh ghost lore throughout the ages, examined through a contemporary lens. So without further ado, I pass you over to Delyth. Thank you very much.
Diolch yn fawr. So, there we go, it's working. So, today I'm here to talk to you about my main area of research, which is the appearance of spirits within the Welsh tradition. That is, how do spirits and any other entity which you might class under that rather nebulous term, quite literally appear in Wales. So I think, as a starting point, it's probably a good idea to roughly familiarise ourselves with the state of play in terms of contemporary academic study of Welsh ghost lore. Spoiler alert, it's practically non-existent. So people like Adam Coward, Carol Jones and John Harvey have, over the years, made some inroads into the subject. But other than that, the most Wales tends to offer is volume after volume of coffee table ghost books containing the same recycled tales aimed predominantly at tourists and those wanting an overview of some of our myths and legends. And while these texts provide an invaluable service in introducing some of the most fundamental aspects of our unique culture and heritage to a wider audience, they don't come close to helping us determine what a ghost is and how it appears within the Welsh tradition. So now that we've concluded there's a significant lack of rigorous academic study of Welsh ghost lore, we also have to acknowledge the fact that there's specific limitations which make accurate interpretation of any accounts difficult without extensive background knowledge of the history, the culture and the language. And again, we'll talk specifically about these later on. But the one thing that always strikes me doing this research is how often the Welsh belief system tends to get lumped in with the British experience, with British usually meaning English and perhaps a polite nod to Wales now and again. However, the research I've done to date suggests that Welsh ghost lore develops and then survives independently and is therefore deserving of study on its own merit. So, when I talk about the limitations of the sources, what do I mean? Well, if we look at the people who were collecting these early examples of ghost stories in Wales during the time, people like Thomas Pennant, Richard Baxter, Joseph Glanville and John Aubrey, these were wealthy, educated, for the most part upper class, English male antiquarians. And while their accounts are of course invaluable to our understanding of Welsh folk custom during this time, these men had little experience of the folk customs of the lower classes and their belief systems, and had a tendency to present their own religious or societal biases in their work. They're not the farmers, they're not the miners, they're not the quarrymen who would have been sharing these ghost stories around the fire at this time. What would have been termed in Welsh the gwerin, which was a word to describe working class people who are extremely knowledgeable about the history and of the culture and the folklore of their particular area, despite possessing little or no formal education. We also need to consider the impact of the religious movement during this time. In previous centuries, the relationship between ghosts and the church were inextricably linked. But with the arrival of the Protestant Reformation and the subsequent rejection of the concept of purgatory and, by association, Catholicism, the relationship between the living and the dead fundamentally changed. With opposing Lutheran and Calvinistic beliefs in the appearance of spirits following the Reformation, there was a movement among dissenting ministers, so that's Protestants, who refused to recognise the supremacy of the established church, as well as other Protestants and Catholic clergymen from across Britain, to use accounts of apparitions to prove the survival of the soul after death as a rebuke against atheism. But with all this in mind, we do have one trump card in Wales, one text that is completely unique in terms of recording early Welsh ghost lore, which I think is probably worthy of mention here. I'm talking about the Reverend Edmund Jones, a hen Brythwyd, the old prophet of Tranch in Pontypool, a man who anyone with a semblance of interest in Welsh ghost lore should probably get to know, and someone who's more than worthy of a special mention here. He was born in 1702 in the parish of Aberystwyth. He gained the title the Old Prophet because his near enough folkloric status as a prognosticator. He was an avid astrologer and a botanist, and saw divinity reflected in all aspects of the natural world. Though Jones had very little formal education to speak of, he was particularly studious and published several works during his lifetime, chiefly comprising of sermons and doctrines, along with 2 surviving volumes which dealt with the occult and the supernatural. He began preaching at the tender age of 19 before spending a remarkable and gruelling 70 years travelling the length and breadth of Wales on horseback and on foot, preaching the gospel to all the sinners of the country. And it was while on his travels like this that he collected the wealth of stories concerning ghosts, fairies, demons and angels and witches that survive today. What makes Jones's work so invaluable is his propensity for collecting first-hand, genuine supernatural encounters, at least as far as he was concerned, from all social classes without discrimination. His only criterion for inclusion was that he considered that person a God-fearing Christian. And while his methods are far from unbiased, his writing paints a broad and relatively unfiltered picture of Wales's supernatural belief system during the 18th century, which is why his 1780s book, A Relation of Apparitions of Spirits in the Principality of Wales, is an exceptional and in many ways completely unrivalled chronicle of the country's ghost lore, as important in its portrayal of 18th century Welsh cultural landscape as it is in the accounts themselves. So following on from Jones, later collections from the 19th to the early 20th centuries, with the emergence of folklore study as a recognised discipline within antiquarianism, saw a shift in the importance of obtaining accounts from the lower classes, while still placing a lot of reliance on the content of earlier works. In fact, the first folkloric study of a region by someone who was a born and bred Welshman was only made in 1802 by William Williams of Llan in observations on the Snowdon Mountains. And he makes no bones in pointing out the absurd conjecture and misrepresentation of those who have of late years undertaken to describe this country. Some give manifestly wrong interpretations of the names of places, and others, either ignorantly or maliciously, have, as it were, caricatured its inhabitants. In Wales, in particular, many of these collections came from the life's work of various clergymen scholars, often the same folk who were responsible for collecting parish histories, with some vested interest in preserving and amplifying Welsh culture, and more often than not local to the area that they were writing about. Because of their clerical background, They sometimes impart a degree of bias within their works, writing cynically about the paranormal and quite quick to dismiss supernatural tendencies. But because of their shared interest in spirits of both holy and supernatural origin, many a local ghoul has luckily found its way into the pages of Welsh theological texts, if we only care to look. And having spent months thumbing through dozens of books about the history of Methodism in various areas across the country, let me tell you, it's definitely not for the faint of heart. As well as the occasional dry text, we also have another limitation when approaching ghost lore, and even folklore as a whole in Wales, and that is the tendency for collectors to present over-romanticised and over-embellished versions of their accounts. While contemporary writing about Welsh folklore has a growing tendency to erase all regional variation and portray any custom as having taken place in a nebulous Wales, our late 19th and early 20th centuries antiquarians, people such as Wirt Sykes and Marie Trevelyan, were instead quite fond of enhancing their tales. Again, this isn't altogether surprising, given that these folklorists were writing during the tail end of the Industrial Revolution, where Wales as a whole, but especially the south, had been transformed beyond recognition. This occurred with such rapidity, overwhelming the landscape, the language and the culture, that many of its inhabitants, including some of these authors, and in particular their readers and their contributors, were desperately yearning for some semblance of their traditional heritage. While these folklore collections remain invaluable today, you therefore need to use a little bit of caution when you're interpreting their content. And just as a final example of why an understanding of culture, history and language of Wales is so important before you begin to analyse its ghost lore, and perhaps why you needn't always confine yourself to reading dry, musty books about the regional history of Methodism. I have here an example of a llên-gwerinydd, a nursery rhyme, which is given its name to the title of the talk and was probably the first one I ever remember learning as a child growing up in Prydeinig. Bwgan bolol a thwll yn ei fol, digon o le I geffyl a throl. Lol Bogey with a hole in its belly, plenty of room for a horse and trolley. So on the face of it, a simplistic couplet about an ambiguous phantom, but with a little knowledge, there's much more to it that meets the eye. So the word bwgan can be translated as ghost, hobgoblin, bugbear or bogey. Bolol can also mean hobgoblin, bogey or even the devil, and is sometimes used to describe pitch black darkness. It's a word that's found almost exclusively in northwest Wales, predominantly within the old county of Meirionydd. For example, llygad y bolol, the eye of the bolol, is the colloquial name for the field poppy in Gwynedd because of the black spots that you find at the base of its petals. So now we know that this is a nursery rhyme that's originated in northwest Wales, and that's certainly the only place I've heard it being recited. Especially for me, sort of growing up in Prydeinig and being terrified of this devil that hid in the hollows of trees in the dark. But thinking about the purpose of this rhyme then, you'd be forgiven for thinking that it was a sort of nonsense rhyme to amuse children, but it actually reflects a theme that we see extremely often within Welsh ghost lore, and that is to serve as a warning. So a warning of danger on the roads, a warning for truanting children, and a warning for those travelling home at night from work or from the market. So what first appears as an amusing couplet to entertain children instead tells us so much more about the richness and complexity of Welsh folklore than first meets the eye. And perhaps more importantly, it's a perfect example of ghost lore that is still active and still circulating within communities today. So now we understand a little of the history and a little of the limitations of Welsh ghost lore research. If we want to understand how spirits appear, perhaps it's easier to start with the motifs we don't see in Wales. Incidentally, This is one of my favourite depictions of a ghost in Wales. It's an engraving by Hugh Hughes for the book written by Peter Roberts at Hanafion Cymreig, which was published in 1823. Fantastic engraving. So I think it's safe to say that the Welsh are yet to solve the age-old riddle of what a ghost actually is. And I think it's probably fair to say that if you asked 100 different people what they thought a ghost was, you'd probably get close to 100 different answers. Now, if you ask those same people what a ghost looks like, the answer will be a little bit more consistent. Casper, Ghostbusters, M.R. James, the only item a child or a skint student needs to dress up as a ghost for Halloween. The white sheet. This is the stereotypical image of a ghost that has existed for centuries, from our historical accounts right through to our popular culture in our children's television, theatres, Hollywood and books. Now, in 2013, the folklorist Paul Cowdell did some research into the contemporary experiences and beliefs of people who had reportedly seen ghosts, which was published in his chapter in the Ashgate Research Companion for Paranormal Cultures. He found that out of the 110 respondents that talked about having seen a ghost, they didn't really mention seeing a white sheet, but it was very much used as a base to start their discussion. So even if that wasn't their experience, it still shows that it's regarded as a sort of significant cultural figure nonetheless. And that's what got me thinking, well, what about Wales? Well, with the help of lots of tea, I read through quite literally hundreds of different texts, be that folklore texts, parish history accounts, tourist books, pamphlets, manuscripts or newspapers, any source that might include any reference to a ghost in Wales appearing in a white sheet, or even just dressed in white more generally, covering a period of roughly 400 years, from the late 16th century to the early 20th. And here are the 5 cases that I found. The first comes from the Welsh anti-witchcraft treatise Calan Gaeaf, The Devil's Hatred, which was written circa 1711, where the author T.P. describes a spirit in shining white clothing appearing to a sick young man before curing him. There are 2 cases of ghosts in white clothing in Llandasil, in Ceredigion, reported in 1896 by the same storyteller, neither of which are first-hand accounts. There's the infamous fighting ghost of Tondir, the only case out of the however many hundreds of ghost stories that specifically mentions it being shrouded in white. The haunting was first reported in the Evening Express on the 5th of September in 1904 and describes a frightening spectre that notoriously tried to strangle workmen when they were passing the disused colliery in awdur. Interestingly, subsequent sightings of the ghost neglect to describe any white shroud and instead refer only to its cavernous eyes. And lastly, there's a haunting which takes place down the road from where I grew up in Abererch in Gwynedd, and it involves a style known as Canfa Angharad, which Myrdd records as being terrorised by a group of men dressed in white clothing who then turn into a leaping pack of greyhounds in 1908. And that's the very realistic police sketch of that fighting ghost of Tondir there, so you can probably understand why it made it into a lot of the newspapers at the time. So only 5 cases of ghosts dressed in white, one of which happens to be in a white shroud, spanning hundreds of years of reports of Welsh ghostly sightings and folklore. So I think we can safely conclude that white ghosts don't really feature here in any significant form, with the obvious exception of a laddie wen, the white lady, a motif that I'll talk about later on. But how do we go about analysing these cases, and why is the lack of Welsh ghosts in white sheets so interesting? Well, if we first take a brief look into the history of the white sheet in Britain, the most popular theory is the fact that the dead were traditionally buried in a burial shroud, which was more likely to be white. While the theory doesn't quite hold water, we do know that during the medieval period, ghosts of the dead were, or the dead were popularly depicted in their burial shrouds. Poorer folk were often just buried in linen, as coffins were obviously more expensive. But in Britain between 1666 and 1814, in support of the British textiles industry, it was mandated that these shrouds were made from wool. So, and these more often were white. When the Act was repealed in 1814, the move was made to bury people in their Sunday best. Possibly explains why the narrative round about this time changes, with ghosts of the 19th century onwards being more likely to appear in the clothes that they were buried in, although there are still a number of examples of ghosts in winding sheets roaming the streets of England after this time. The vast majority of reports describing ghosts in sheets, however, relate to hoaxers and pranksters. This is an age-old occurrence. Lucian of Samosata, around the 1st century Common Era, describes how young men used to dress up in black sheets to frighten people. It's mentioned by Reginald Scott in the 16th century in the discovery of witchcraft as a very effective method of scaring people out of their money. And there's even a 19th century case of a bricklayer in Hammersmith being killed, having been mistaken for a ghost because of his white uniform. So the idea was obviously quite ingrained within popular consciousness, even at that point. It's therefore not surprising that the image of the ghost in the white sheet has found its home within our popular culture. From the frightening figures that were seen in the magic lantern shows in the 18th century to the later sort of more laughable figures that Hollywood portrayed in their slapstick films. But why did we believe in Wales? What did we believe in Wales, and why is that so different to the rest of Britain? Well, there's a lot that's been written in England about the dead quite literally rising from their graves to trouble the living. One of the most famous examples comes from 1598, Demonology by King James I of England, where he quite literally describes the devil as carrying bodies out of the grave to serve his turn for a space. Conversely, the notion of a body rising from the grave is exceedingly uncommon in Welsh folklore. We more often than not describe spirits materialising from the ether or being sent down from the heavens. So, with this being the case, it's no real surprise that Welsh folk didn't envisage their loved ones turning up dressed in their finest burial shrouds. Another difference lies in the fact that much of the medieval religious iconography that existed within places of worship in Wales was destroyed during the suppression of the monasteries. And by doing so, these sort of illiterate and predominantly monoglot lower classes couldn't depend on it anymore for their ghost lore, and instead had to rely on their own imaginations, a point we'll discuss in more detail later on. But it's also important for us to consider these cases within the ever-changing Welsh cultural landscape. We mentioned earlier about the scale and the rapidity of the changes that were brought on predominantly by the Industrial Revolution during the 18th and 19th centuries, which saw Welsh identity and culture being increasingly oppressed. In a matter of a century, Welsh had gone from being a universally spoken language to being spoken by barely half the population. The secondary effects of mainly English and Irish immigration in previously rural and very close-knit communities, especially within places like the mining communities of South Wales, and the introduction of the despotic Welsh Not, for instance, in schools across the country, saw the attempted eradication of an entire culture by the British state. People like Professor Jane Aaron have written about how the Industrial Revolution affected the appearance of ghosts within Welsh Gothic literature. Similarly, we find many of our ghost accounts have evolved with the changing landscape. The litany of death omens that became a common sighting within the mining communities is a prime example of this. It's also important to consider the religious landscape. So every point in our history that I've noted here will have influenced the community's interpretation of a supernatural event, as well as the interpretation of those people recording those histories. So the year of one particular revival is important to our cause here. 1904, the year of the fighting ghost of Tondir, and as it happens, the largest religious revival of its kind in Wales within the 20th century, which was responsible for converting thousands of households across the country, with newspapers playing a major role in this. While the previous sort of 1859 revival had been associated more with phenomena such as canu yn yr awdur, so singing in the sky, hearing phantom voices, or choirs singing in the clouds. In 1904, the revival was heavily associated with ghostly visions sent as a sign from the heavens. Interestingly, some of these accounts are readily comparable with those more abstract apparitions which were recorded in the 16th to the 18th century in Wales, which we'll mention later. So it just goes to show how these accounts weave in with the beliefs and experiences of the people that relay them at that time. Another angle that makes interpretation of these cases difficult, which we need to mention before we take a deep dive into Welsh ghost lore, is the language. So in Welsh, the word for ghost, ysbryd, is also the name for spirit, soul, spectre, temperament, emotion, feeling, liveliness and breath. It's a word that's used to encompass a broad variety of different supernatural entities, especially in early Welsh accounts. Much more akin to the earliest use of the word ghost in Old English, used in the early medieval period to mean a spirit of any kind rather than its sort of later, narrower definition. As an example, if we look at that haunting at Calan Gaeaf, where the area was terrorised by a group of men dressed in white, while myrdd uses the term ysbryd for this shape-shifting ghost, the appearance of a group of men in uniform might also lead one to suspect that this account has got as much to do with Tylwyth, the fairies, as it does with ghosts. Groups of supernatural beings are often seen or perceived as fairies in Wales. The Reverend Edmund Jones himself describes a company of spirits with speckled clothes of white and red colour, who appeared to an innkeeper in his bedchamber in Llên-gwerinydd in 1767. Jones speculates in his book that by their appearing with speckled clothes, I'm inclined to think that they were of the fairy sort. The transition of these ghosts into greyhounds at Calan Gaeaf might also put us in mind of the hounds of the Tylwyth, sometimes known as cŵn bendith y themâu, although it's important to remember that ghostly greyhounds aren't without precedent in Wales. Similarly, the case from 1711 that was recorded by TP in Calan Gaeaf of that shining white spirit healing the sick gentleman reads more typically of an angelic visitation rather than the ghost proper. And people like Edmund Jones have again recorded demonic beings as appearing dressed in white within Welsh folklore. I've included an example here of a demonic entity that was raised by a conjurer called John Jenkins in Pembrokeshire to help find a lost sum of money for a client, an entity which could easily be misinterpreted as a ghost without that background knowledge. The problem with the interpretation of the vast majority of these cases arises when the Welsh language accounts are translated poorly, missing that nuance between ysbrydion, ghosts, and ysbrydoedd, spirits, and where these accounts are interpreted on an individual basis without considering them within the broader folkloric and cultural context. So we've seen the problems that arise with researching Welsh ghost lore. We've discussed what we won't see in cases of hauntings in Wales, but now we get to the meaty part of the talk where we come face to face with the ghost within the Welsh tradition. So you might be asking yourself at this point, what do I do when I meet a ghost in Wales? Well, luckily for you, the writers of the 19th century have got you covered. There are some set universal rules to follow, and most of the stories from this time don't deviate from these particular characteristics, regardless of where you are in the country. So the first is that if a ghost, if it's of the orthodox kind, will only ever appear to one specific person in the whole world. One of the many reasons why the fighting ghost of Tondir, we mentioned earlier, has got to be a hoax, because he turned up and showed himself to 12 people at once. The second is that it will only ever speak to that person when they're alone. The third is that a ghost cannot start a conversation. Unfortunately, you're going to have to instigate it if you're keen to get that unpleasant business wrapped up quickly. The fourth is that in order to instigate, you'll have to first command it to relay its message in the name of the Trinity. The fifth is, stick to the point, no unnecessary chatter. Any questions about its condition would be perceived as very embarrassing and uncouth, and nobody wants to embarrass a ghoul. And lastly, and perhaps most importantly, once that ghost relays its message, you are then bound to complete the task set, or else prepare for the worst. You'll have 3 chances by the ghost to get things done. If you fail or neglect your duty, you could expect a disgruntled ghost on the first visit, a bit of an earful on the second visit, and on the third, threats of tearing your body to pieces if you don't get it done there and then. I'm pretty sure there aren't many accounts of a ghost having to ask a 4th time. So these are the universally held beliefs in Wales regarding ghostly etiquette, which we see repeated time and time again throughout our folklore. Ghosts appearing to relay a message, so essentially ghosts with unfinished business, being one of the main reasons why a restless spirit would present itself. And that's something we see across British ghost lore more generally. They'll either be searching for justice for a wrong done to them during life, or wanting a message delivered that they weren't able to convey themselves, or what we see a lot in Wales is ghosts turning up to point out the location of lost items or hidden treasure. And there are countless examples across the centuries, all the way back to some of our earliest written accounts in the 17th century. But while that's a very common motif within British ghost lore more generally, we certainly have some noteworthy spirits which are uniquely specific to Welsh ghost lore and separates us from the rest of Britain. So we'll take a look at some of these to finish. So from the earliest hauntings recorded by clergymen such as the Reverend Edmund Jones, who we discussed earlier, rather than spectral, shrouded figures, folk were more prone to reporting distorted or abstract forms and shapes. So if we look specifically at Jones's body of work, we see various weird accounts presented as everyday, matter-of-fact occurrences. Examples like a living thing round like a ball rolling across the lane in Bedwas, a big, tall, dark and shapeless thing, which then shape-shifted into 2 black post-like forms in Cwmbran, a sight that frightened the eyewitness so much that he was said to have needed to lean on a cow to get his breath back. A strange blue fire that burnt weekly about Harlech for several months, a ghost in Pembrokeshire with the likeness of a man but without any arms and without a hat, and a white floating thing that took the form of a pyramid in Pontypool. Now, to understand why Welsh ghosts appeared this way, which is quite distinct from the spirits described by preceding English antiquarians such as Glanville and Aubrey, then we first need to consider the history of religion in Wales up to that point. So this slide here is an example of a late medieval wall painting which was uncovered at St Cadog's Church in Llancarvan in 2010, which shows St George and the Dragon and then the 7 deadly sins on the right there. These sorts of illustrations would at one point or another have more or less covered the walls of our medieval churches in Wales, and Welsh decorations were noted to be really similar to English decorations. At a time where sort of printed books weren't available and the majority of the congregation would have been illiterate monoglots, certainly not able to read Latin or French, this would have been the method used by priests to teach and impress their flocks. So during the dissolution of the monasteries during the reign of Henry VIII and later under increasing puritanical influence during the 16th century, most of the medieval ecclesiastical iconography that existed within manuscripts and within places of worship in Wales were largely destroyed. In 1547, King Edward VI ordered the destruction of all popish and superstitious books and images, so at that point paintings like the ones at St Cadog's would have been limewashed over. With this sort of monastic iconography gone, academics like John Harvey have theorised that the lower classes could no longer depend on this imagery for their ghost lore, and instead had to rely on their own relatively limited imaginations. When this is taken into account, it's not altogether surprising that the phantoms of the 17th and the 18th centuries resemble sort of perversions of the mundane or distortions of universal fears, so things like wild animals, weather phenomena or fire, that is, familiar forms presented within a supernatural light. So that's one theory, and I think there's probably a lot of truth behind that idea, but I also think there's more to it than that. So if we look towards ghost stories that were being recorded before the dissolution of the monasteries, as I said, we don't really have many of those manuscripts or the iconography that survives in Wales today, but we do have surviving manuscripts in England. And there's a stark similarity between our 18th century ghost lore in Wales and what was being recorded over the border during the medieval period in England. So the Byland Abbey ghost stories, for example, were recorded by Cistercian monks in North Yorkshire around about 1400 and were first transcribed by none other than the king of ghost stories himself, M.R. James, in 1922. And here they record the form of a horse, but standing on its hind legs, which then morphs into the shape of a revolving bale of hay with light beaming at its centre, a spectral raven with sparks of fire shooting from its wings, the likeness of a revolving canvas with four corners that rolls away into the darkness, and a very small thing which rolled in a certain sock above the ground. So these are stories that could be lifted straight from the works of Edmund Jones in 1780. Now, there's a big question to be answered about why our earliest recorded ghosts in Wales are mirroring those of the medieval period in England. Questions which I'm hoping to answer over the next year or so of my research into this particular area. But regardless of that oddity, you'd think that with increasing literacy, sort of the movement of people and the pervading influence of popular culture, that these distorted forms would more or less die out. And it's probably true to say that there are fewer cases of abstract ghouls reported by the 20th century, but it'd be wrong to say that this motif disappears from Wales completely. In fact, quite the opposite. So there are dozens and dozens of accounts where ghosts appear or disappear in balls or wheels of fire right through up to the present day, with a huge resurgence of this phenomena during the 1904 religious revival in particular. For example, there's a case in Dolbenmaen in Gwynedd, which was recorded as late as the 1970s, of a gate on a footpath suddenly turning into a wheel of fire, speeds down the road and disappears into a lake. There's an even later account which reads quite similarly to the round ball of Bedwas, or the floating pyramid of Monmouthshire, which was recorded in 2005 in Ynys Môn in Anglesey. Two friends, on returning home from a fishing trip at dusk, reported to have seen a large, white, opaque, cylindrical object floating above the sea and travelling inland, where it then vanished as it approached the dunes. The story sort of sounds a bit like a UFO sighting more than anything, but it's still presented as an abstract ghost sighting, exactly the same as those recorded by Edmund Jones almost 3 whole centuries ago, showing that the sort of rather unique tradition of sighting weird, distorted phantom forms and figures has survived in some form within the Welsh folkloric tradition, even up to the present day. And while we've been talking, some of you may have noticed that little chap in the corner there. This is only the second surviving example of death and the gallant, the medieval sort of dance of death motif to have survived in Britain. And as you can see, death is dressed in a white shroud. And while it's an exceptionally rare image to find in surviving medieval ecclesiastical wall paintings, it does prove that the white sheet was present in Wales for centuries in some form. It just hasn't made that leap into our folklore, which by itself is fascinating. Anyway, moving on now to another of Wales's enduring motifs, spirits in animal form. These represent a particularly prominent aspect of Welsh ghost lore when compared to sightings beyond Offa's Dyke. Phantom animal sightings reported by the Society for Psychical Research from across Britain represent a very, very small proportion of cases, whereas Wales is quite literally crawling with examples. So incredibly, about a quarter of all our ghost sightings in Wales appear as spirits in animal form. And this number doesn't really change between historical and contemporary accounts. The reason, I imagine, is probably very much the same as what we've already discussed. There would have been a universal fear of animals, wild animals in particular, and so it's no wonder that they would form a prominent motif amongst the lower classes in particular. But we're not just reporting the usual suspects like the black dogs we see across the rest of Britain. We've got some really unusual choices for phantom beasts here, with a large proportion of these cases involving a shape-shifting element as well. So examples include dancing spectral pigs in Gwent, demonic goslings in Glamorganshire, not one but two ghost donkeys in Llanwynno, ghost sheep in Llanegrin, giant ghost cats in Penmaen Mawr and in Anglesey, ghost tigers in Berthgelart, ghost horses with flaming hoofs in Nantabetos, and an especially aggressive spectral turkey in Brecon. You name it, we've got it, with some of these fantastical cases I've mentioned being reported as late as the 1970s, so proving that the tradition of sighting spectral Welsh beasts has remained very much alive. Moving on then, death omens in Wales, as with much of Britain, exist in abundance. So from the mundane through to the fantastical, numerous folkloric texts from the 17th to the 20th centuries describe how innumerable natural phenomena could prognosticate everything from births and marriages to the weather and the harvest. But we in Wales have a particular unique propensity for portents of death. From hearing a rooster crow at an unusual time, the screech of the owl or the howl of a dog, or to hear the ghostly bangs and shuffles of a death acting out before it occurred, something often reported as a tollaeth. These are all commonly reported occurrences within Welsh folklore texts and parish history accounts. But bangs and shuffles are probably the least strange of Wales's phantasmal portents. Entities such as the Canwyll Gorff, the corpse candle, arguably the most universally recognised and well established omen across Wales. So for those of you who might not be familiar, the Canwyll Gorff is a supernatural light or flame which foretells the death of an individual, and you might be able to tell who that individual was just by how the flame appeared. The lights were frequently mobile and were usually seen floating along corpse roads. Trucks usually used to transport the coffin to their final resting place. The earliest written account of the apparition is recorded in Wales in a letter by John Lewis, who was Justice of the Peace in Ceredigion, dated 1656 and published in Richard Baxter's A Certainty of the World of Spirits in 1691. Over a century after that, the Canwyll Gorff made its first debut. Edmund Jones wrote the first account of the omen's supposed origins, stating that it was an effect of St. David's prayer, having prayed to God for a sign that the sinful people of mid and southwest Wales would be reminded of their own immortality. And it's this Christian origin story that has prevailed within Welsh folklore and is retold with very little variation from Jones's version in 1780. A toily then represents the phantom funeral within Welsh ghost lore, sometimes referred to as a tollaeth, which is that term that's usually referred to as the death rappings or knockings that we were talking about earlier, sometimes known as a drachiolaeth in Powys, or even a cyhyraeth in parts of Carnarvonshire. The earliest written records of this entity associate it very much with the Tylwyth Teg, the fairies, which prevails really until the 19th century, after which the funeral was largely considered more of a ghostly procession. In any case, these processions were so common that folklorists such as Gymrawd have reported how elderly folk, while walking the roads after dark, were in the habit of keeping to the very edge of the path to avoid being swept along by this entity. It's also unusual in that multiple witnesses would often report having seen one. You just better hope you saw yourself as part of the procession, otherwise you'd probably likely be the one in the coffin. Moving on to the Caerdydd then, this is an omen which is likely recorded specifically as a portentous entity for the first time by, again, Edmund Jones. It's an auditory omen that howls 3 times to forewarn the listener of a death. So Jones states that it's predominantly said to haunt those areas running along the River Tywys on its course from Ceredigion through Carmarthenshire, and it's also strongly associated with Pembrokeshire, particularly the bishopric of St David's, because St David's mother Non lived here. Again, this origin story has well and truly stuck, the only folkloric update being added in 1839 by Charles Redwood in the book The Vale of Glamorgan, where the Caerdydd had now moved and was shrieking along the southern coast to warn fishermen of stormy weather and impending shipwrecks. With regards to the Corn Annwn then, the psychopompic hounds of Annwn, whose howling was believed to foretell death, these are without doubt our oldest omens within the Welsh tradition. So they're first recorded in the 14th century in the first branch of the Mabinogi as the hunting dogs of Arawn, king of Annwn, the otherworld in Welsh mythology. They were classically described as being shining white with red ears, but they're also described throughout our folklore in all manners of shapes and sizes and coat colours, so black, red, spotted, dripping in gore, and even fire-breathing in meirionydd. In any case, it's actually Edmund Jones, again, that then records them as having evolved into death omens specifically, as well as introducing some new terminology for them. So we've got corn wibdaith or corn awdur, sky dogs, gwillgun, wild dogs, and corn bendith y mamau, so the hounds of the blessings of the mothers or the hounds of the fairies. The terminology in Wales is extremely interchangeable, and it's largely dependent on the area in which they were sighted or heard. Jones also exemplifies an unusual attribute to the Corn Annwn, which isn't generally associated with the broader characteristics of the spectral hunting dog outside of Wales. And that is that their howls are louder at a distance and then fade on approach. A similar attribute to that of the Caerdydd's wailing. It's a peculiarity that seems to have originated from Jones's collection, although the concept of inversion is very common in early modern views on witchcraft. So it might have originated from Jones's own obsession with witches. But again, this has been repeated so many times across the centuries that it's now embedded itself as canon, even if those later authors weren't aware of Jones's work. Lastly then, I'll mention the particularly unpleasant hag-like spectre called Gwrach yr Hibyn, which very loosely translates to Hag of the Mist or Wailing Witch, depending on whose work you read. Similarly, some folklore texts record it as being an omen that's only found in the old county of Glamorgan, but actually she appears in several different locations across the whole country, so isn't isolated by any means. She's more often sighted in the vicinity of water, sometimes at a crossroads, and was generally thought to stay concealed in fog until an unwary traveller happened to come upon her, where she could be heard screaming horribly, either calling for her husband, wife or child, depending on which of the traveller's relations was about to die, and beating the water with her hands as she did so. If she wasn't screaming any words, then unfortunately your own luck was very much about to run out. Another ghoulish lady that probably deserves a mention tonight is a Laddie Wen, the White Lady. She serves as her own stereotypical folkloric entity, found in folklore records across the whole of Britain and Ireland, as well as further afield. I don't know whether we can boast the most amount of Laddie Wen sightings than anywhere else, but she certainly has become an integral part of our ghost lore and our culture, and even within those sort of few communities where ghost stories are relatively lacking, you're bound to find a laddie wen hiding there somewhere. Although she can present at any time of year, she's frequently seen in association with Norse Calan Gaeaf, Halloween, preferably sat on top of a stile, waiting to pounce on unsuspecting children on their way home from the festivities. But we unfortunately see similar issues with the misinterpretation of this motif within contemporary analysis too. So a lot of this is down to an article that was penned by Jane Beck, an American folklorist in the 1970s. And she said that the White Lady could be split into two separate groups. So Dynes Mewn Gwyn, the lady in white, which was used to describe the more sort of traditional figure of a revenant in a white garb. And the laddie wen, the white lady, who was specifically an ethereal spirit that she claimed haunted locations that a violent accident was said to have occurred. But when you examine the primary sources, there's very little tangible evidence to suggest that these two distinct categories exist within the Welsh folkloric tradition. The use of Dynes Mewn Gwyn as a label is rarely found, while the term laddie wen is pervasive and used to denote most apparitions that present in this particular way. Similarly, Jane Beck has suggested that the image of the White Lady was very old, resulting from pre-Christian beliefs subsumed into modern religious doctrines, a suggestion that I've seen repeated by a lot of different folklorists and academics with regards to Welsh folklore study. Links have been suggested between her and the fairies, and even early goddess or deity worship. In Wales, however, if you read the primary sources, these links are tenuous at best and at worst misrepresent and over-romanticise those texts. A lot of those assumptions made by previous authors have overlooked the evidence presented within the original Welsh language sources, which I'm sure you'll agree seems to be the overwhelming theme within a lot of Welsh folklore study. So, as we've seen throughout this talk, there are so many motifs that exist within Welsh ghost lore that appear for the first time during the 17th and the 18th centuries in the works of Edmund Jones and the like, that not only survive in the retelling, but snowball and then become an integral part of the Welsh narrative. So everything from the lack of white ghosts, the myriad of abstract ghouls and wheels of fire, swathes of spirits in animal form, and our phantasmal death omens, to name just a few of these motifs. They're all motifs that are reported within contemporary sources. They've not just survived, but they've flourished. And that's why, while some of these stories have rarely, if ever, travelled outside the borders of Wales, it would be wrong to somehow suggest that they're lost or forgotten, words which are far too readily applied simply because audiences outside of Wales have struggled with their contextualisation and translation, and those of us who know the stories well haven't always succeeded in transmitting them to the wider audience. But one of the most poignant reminders of this came to me only recently. My publishers had sent a proof copy of the Folklore of Wales to the Skewen-based storyteller Owen Staton. Some of you may know him from his podcast Time Between Times. So he contacted me having read the chapter on ghosts with unfinished business, in which I've included one of Edmund Jones's more fantastical accounts, shall we say, so that of a ghost of a well-dressed woman who appears to the son of an innkeeper in Ysbryd and then flies him off to Philadelphia on a Friday evening to retrieve £200 in a box hidden under a board in a strange house, makes him cast it into the Black Sea, and then returns him home in time for tea on Monday. Now, the reason Owen contacted me was to let me know that he'd done a storytelling event in Coelbren in the Swansea Valley some time ago, and that several of the audience members had come up to him at the end and recounted this particular story to him with very, very little variation from that original 1780 account. only that they knew the name of the inn, which was Tafarn y Garreg. And in fact, that story is one that Owen has now included in his own repertoire. Now, there's something quite incredible about the survival of a story, largely unchanged for almost 3 centuries, documented by a chap that hardly anyone knows outside Welsh folklore circles. But with that story that Owen has told and continues to tell himself, as well as countless other similar examples, we've got evidence here of the earliest recorded accounts of Welsh ghost lore continuing to actively circulate and thrive within communities, and that's got to be something worth celebrating. So we've had a whistle-stop tour through the appearances of spirits within the Welsh folkloric tradition over the centuries, covering why ghost lore study is tricky in Wales, why you would need a good understanding of the historical, cultural and linguistic landscape in order to appreciate these accounts fully, how Welsh ghosts don't appear, as well as some of the unique ways Welsh ghosts do appear, and how these motifs then translate into contemporary accounts. But why is this so important? Well, because there's a clear lack of research into Welsh ghost lore and folklore more generally. Welsh belief systems have been continuously lumped in with the British experience, even in contemporary analysis by respected researchers and academics, whereas my research suggests that folklore, at least the ghost lore of Wales, develops and then perhaps more importantly survives independently and is deserving of study on its own merit. Diolch yn fawr. Thank you.
Well, wasn't that fantastic? Diolch yn fawr iawn chi, oedd absolutely brilliant. Learned so much. I know now how to treat a ghost when I meet him tonight. I know the protocol.
Critical information.
Critical. And the thing about intangible cultural heritage is so important. Those tales that go through that are so important. Even though we look after documentary heritage here at the library, the intangible is fantastic. Anyway, we've got a couple of times from questions. So, any questions from anybody? We have a roving mic as well.
Hello. I was just wondering, as an expert, what your favourite ghost tale to tell on Halloween is.
So my favourite story is one, it's actually a favourite motif, which I haven't mentioned here, but is uniquely Welsh in its own right. And it's a motif that first appears in 1831, and it's recorded by a chap called William Howells, who writes a fantastically cynical book called Cambrian Superstitions, which he writes in a hurry because he's keen to get some prize money that a newspaper is offering. He first records a story of a spectre that haunts a particular road and wails out on a particular night. A hir yw'r dydd, a hir yw'r nos, a hir yw aros. Noah. So long is the day, and long is the night, and long is the wait for Noah. And then one night, a stranger appears in that community at the local pub. Surprise, surprise, his name is Noah. He goes out to meet the ghost because somehow he knows that the ghost is waiting for him, and both the ghost and Noah disappear forever. And this is a motif that is repeated. You see it peppered across the whole of Wales. So it's seen down south, it's seen all the way up in Trawsfynydd area. It lasts for about a century and then disappears completely. But my favourite version of that story is one that Daniel Sylvan Evans records in 1882 in a folkloric text called Asten Sioned, which is my favourite folklore text. It's brilliant. And they record the story as having happened in Caerdydd, as it happens. And it's in a farmhouse, and the farmer and his wife are troubled for years by the ghost that stays in their spare bedroom and makes the noise of all the furniture being broken to pieces, and then after having his way with all the furniture, then shouts out, hir yw dydd, a hir yw nos, a hir yw aros, arawn. Now, using Arawn's name is particularly interesting because, as we know, Arawn was the king of Annwn in the Mabinogi, so it already imparts that sort of mythical quality to the story. And as it happens, one stormy night, a stranger turns up at the door wanting to stay, and lo and behold, that stranger's name is Arawn. So he goes to stay in that bedroom, and the following morning they go in.
You guessed it.
The bed's not been slept in, but both the ghost and the chap have disappeared. Jane Aron's written about this particular story, and it's really interesting. So she writes that using Arawn in this connotation could be more sort of to appeal to, essentially it's one of those other stories that is written during the tail end of the Industrial Revolution. So appealing for Arawn to come and potentially sort of save Wales at its time of need has got its own interesting connotations there. But that's my favourite ghost story in Wales, and my favourite motif as well.
That's great. Any other questions? Well, plethora now.
Have you during your studies come across Welsh stories about seafaring ghosts, or ghost ships, such like? That's not been mentioned. It's not an omission, but I'm interested because my father, who was a well-respected doctor in Anglesey, swore that he saw a nautical ghost on a home visit in Holyhead once. So have you come across that in your studies?
Yeah, there are plenty of seafaring ghosts. It's not something that is talked about particularly often, but there are certainly ghost ships. There's an account that comes from Tenby, which reads more like a sort of fairy tale than an actual sort of eyewitness account of a ship coming into harbour during a terrible storm, and you just hear the wails and shrieks of people on board, but nobody can get out to that ship. And the following morning, sort of everybody's disappeared. So we do see them. If you have a ghost story, please send them to me, because I am collecting accounts as we go through and hoping to preserve them. I have a huge database of ghost accounts from Wales at home, and it'd be lovely to get contemporary accounts to add to that. But there is, in the book, there's a chapter about water spirits, so we talk about sort of lake dwelling and river dwelling, cryptozoological as well as ghosts. But at the end of that, there is a nod towards ghost ships and ghostly sea creatures as well.
Thank you. Thank you for that talk. I found it really, really interesting.
Thank you.
I'm interested a little bit in terms of your background. It's a very, very niche subject area that you're studying. I'm just interested in what pointed you in that direction. I'd love you to say you grew up in a haunted house or something, but just interested in your background.
So I've always had an interest in Welsh folklore, and particularly ghost lore, whether that's because my dad brought me up with sort of recorded black and white creaky old horror films on VHS that we used to sort of watch when mum wasn't looking. I couldn't possibly tell you. So I've, for years now, I've trained, I work a day a week I used to work full time. Now I work a day a week as a consultant paediatric pathologist and a day a week as a medical examiner for the NHS. But when I was working full time for the NHS, for years now, I've been collecting antiquarian Welsh books. So I've got a large library now of extremely rare Welsh folklore texts, some of which you will have in the library here, but won't sort of be within sort of private collections otherwise. And because of this, I've started sort of transferring these and translating them into my own database. And the one thing that kept drawing me towards it was the ghost lore. And that's really the reason we chose to write about ghosts for this particular book, was because I had this database already. I just needed those accounts sort of all translating.
Fantastic. Nothing else? Last word.
So I just wonder if there'd been any projects to oral projects to record ghost stories, because as you say, a lot wouldn't have been written down and in Wales.
Yeah, so the museum at St Fagan, Museum Wales, have been recording oral folklore tales for years. That's something that we're looking into trying to restart again. In fact, the chap that I talked about, the storyteller, Owen Staton, has been actively doing that. So he's been going out into communities and recording sort of contemporary ghost accounts from people. But that is something I'm very much looking into doing myself, potentially with Owen in the future.
Thank you, that sounds great. So just leaves me to say thank you very much for attending. Thank you both remotely and physically. Thank you again to our marvellous speaker.
Thank you.
Fantastic. Just a couple of things before you go. The books are available to buy outside the drum, so please get. I'm sure you'd sign them as well. You'd sign them as well. That's brilliant. And some upcoming events which are available to order from our website. Dathlu Richard Price 300, celebrating Richard Price 300, which is on the 9th of November in Drum and online. The Welsh Political Archive Lecture, which is on the 22nd of November in Jomec in Cardiff and online. And the Wales Broadcast Archive presents, in the series that the Wales Broadcast Archives are doing, Carol Parry-Jones on the 30th of November in the Wales Broadcast Archive. So please come along and support those. We'd love to see you. And diolch yn fawr iawn I chi am ddod heno. That was great. I really enjoyed it. Fantastic.